Hello and welcome to Hoop Collective Podcast. We talk about the NBA, which we're doing on Thursday morning. It's almost afternoon because I'm pretty late starting this pod, but the IT department out here in LA was not as effective as the IT department right there in Dallas. I'm going to tell you that. Joining us from New York City, a rare occasion when Tim Bontemps is joining us from his house.
Thankfully, I'm going to be at my house a lot the next few weeks, so I'm looking forward to that.
That hasn't happened in months. Joining us from Dallas, Texas, before he heads off to see the Utah Jazz play the Dallas Mavericks in a hotly contested preseason game this evening, is Ben MacMahon.
Howdy, partner. Should be the debut of the new number 31 for the Dallas Mavericks, Klay Thompson. The old number 31, the last number 31, will be in the building. Jason Terry, assistant coach for the Utah Jazz.
Is Jet Terry a candidate to get his number retired?
This is the first time anybody's worn it since he left Dallas. And obviously, they weren't giving it to just anybody. Clay's wearing it to honor Reggie Miller, but did give Jet a shout out in the press conference when he was asked about the number. I would say Jet has a case. There are two guys in franchise history who played in two NBA finals for the Dallas Mavericks, Jet and Dirk. And they don't win that championship without Jet, that's for sure. So we'll see.
Still an iconic move, getting the Larry O'Brien trophy tattooed onto his bicep and then winning the Larry O'Brien trophy the same year. I mean, that's baller. That's a
he tried it again. He tried it again when he went to Boston a couple years later, and it didn't work out as well. Listen though, if you go 1 for 2 on Larry O'Brien tattoos, that is a pretty good.
I agree. Which of course reminds me of the all-time LeBron moment when he dunked on Jason Terry, who he hated playing against.
Oh yes.
And he said after the game, I was glad it was him.
Well, and listen, that series, that finals actually taught me, and I probably was told this before, but that taught me about the value of delusional self-confidence to an NBA player. Because Wendy, I'm sure you remember, the Heat are up 2-1, and in both the Heat wins, LeBron had guarded Jet in crunch time and shut him down. And I remember game 4 shoot around, talking to Jet, or maybe it was a practice 4, but talking to Jet. And he basically said, I want to see him do that for 7 games. I don't think he can keep it up. And I'm thinking, what in the hell? Like,
trust me, it's kind of an iconic quote, in all honesty.
Like, you're tugging at the cape here. What are you doing? And sure enough, game 4, who hits the dagger from about 28 feet? Jason Eugene Terry. And off the Mavs went.
For sure. By the way, speaking of Clay numbers, number 11, Domantas Sabonis switched his number in Sacramento. He did. We just had him on ESPN last night. So he went from number 10 to number 11, which was his dad's number. Number 11 was retired in Sacramento. I don't think for a Sacramento King. I am unfamiliar with your game, Bob Davies. Bob, I don't know I just didn't know who he was. I apologize if I'm offending longtime Kings supporters. I don't know if he was a Kansas City King or Cincinnati Royal or whatever. But number 11 was retired for the Kings, and it was unretired for Domantas Sabonis. So he is now wearing his dad Arvidas's number that he made famous in Portland. So.
He played for the Rochester Royals a very long time ago.
Wow.
Yeah, first 8 years in the NBA, he played for the Rochester Royals.
Bob Pettit has memories of dominating Bob Davies, I'll bet.
Won a title, 4 All-Star teams, a couple All-NBA teams, NBL MVP in the year before the league officially came into existence. Interesting.
Obviously a stud player. We're learning about him, but he, his family, blessed. And actually, we just looked him up. Like, actually, I think it's probably a great move by his family.
I was going to say, it's certainly going to introduce a lot of people to Bob Davies over the next few weeks.
I was like, Bob Davies, didn't he used to coach Notre Dame? Anyway, speaking of guys who might have their number retired, how about number 1 in San Antonio? How do we feel about where that's going? Because Victor played his first preseason game on Wednesday night. It was not a good performance by him overall. He had I think it was 4 of 15 shooting. He was 0 of 6 on threes. I think he was 1 of 9 on jumpers. So not a banner performance, but there was a couple of jaw-dropping plays, and most importantly, like right in the first quarter, Chris Paul, also playing his first game as a Spur, goes down and throws a lob to Victor. And I'm not sure how you're supposed to defend it. Chris Paul probably has this stat probably exists. Stat Williams probably could come up with this. Chris Paul is, if he's not thrown the most lobs in NBA history,
It's got to be up there.
He's very close. So this is something I didn't really think about when that pairing happened. But you've got one of the greatest lob throwers in the history of the game. And I'm not sure what you do about dealing with Victor on a lob. How are you gonna, as long as Chris Paul
stop
gets
it by Victor shooting a lot of jump shots and not being at the rim.
Well, there's your answer. I think
seriously,
if Chris Paul gets the lob away cleanly, what recourse is there?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of 7-footers who are going to be at the rim still, I think. So it's probably not quite that simple.
But this guy isn't 7 foot.
I understand. But but yeah, look, it's going to be a great weapon. And I do think this game, as we've talked about it a bunch, this game is going to be, I think it's sort of a microcosm of what year 2 for Victor is going to be about. What is the jump shot going to look like? And can he cut down on turnovers? Like in this game, he had 4 assists and 4 turnovers. Obviously, he had one really fancy spin move play, but had several turnovers. And like you said, 0 for 5 on threes, 4 for 15 from the field. Like, the next step for him is to go from being a guy who is a very inefficient shooter to one who gets to league average or above. And his shot looks really clean. Like, I do think, we've talked about it a bunch, I do think in time he's going to shoot good percentages on this stuff. But like that, for him to take the next step as a player, everybody sees the defensive stuff. He's already become one of the best defensive players in the league after 1 year, might be the best. But it's going to be the offensive end and the efficiency there that's going to determine how quickly he gets to be, a guy that's at the very top of the list of players or one that's in the all NBA conversation. And that also determine how quick the Spurs get towards MacMahon's bet that he keeps trying to lower week by week.
And it's an interesting thing because Victor being the most efficient scorer possible is not really the goal right now in San Antonio. They don't want to handcuff him. They want to give him the opportunity to spread his wings. And look, like, nobody here thinks the Spurs are a playoff team this year. Honestly, them being a play-in team is unlikely. And so it's still a developmental type season. And you want, like, they don't want to say, hey, Victor, you can't be shooting threes or you can't put the ball on the floor. They want to give him the opportunity still to kind of explore all of that space. But there's no question at this point in his career, he is definitely much more effective as a finisher than as a creator. And it will be interesting to see how that dynamic works with Chris Paul. And CP3 not only is obviously a great pick and roll operator, but I think he can teach Victor a lot about the nuances of pick and roll play, and then hopefully for the Spurs teach those young guards on the roster some of those nuances. And CP3 I think might be taking credit for Spurs success years down the road.
Can we re-verify, just for people who may not have been listening like a month ago in the dead of the summer, what the terms of the bet were? Just re-verify now.
24.5.
All right. So I don't recall that number, but sounds good.
We had a discussion a month ago about how good the Spurs are going to be, and MacMahon was saying they could win 40 to 42 games. And I said, that's crazy. And I tried to get him to make a bet around there, and he weaseled his way down to 35.5. And then he tried to weasel his way down to 34.5 last week, where we had to correct the record that it was actually 35.5. It was amazing work by him.
We took the
the bet is 35.5, 36 wins or more, MacMahon wins, 35 or less, I win. And it's some sort of nice dinner at some point.
And just to be clear, when I said 40 to 42, that's like a ceiling. right?
I know.
I'm
just messing with you.
Yes.
I know. 30. Like I've told a bunch of people have brought up the bet to me, and a lot of people have said 35.5 within the league. It's a fun number because it's.
Yeah.
I think it's probably a little high. I feel good about winning it, but it's also not out of the realm that they couldn't win 36 or 37 games and you win it. Because if Victor does take a big step, then they could easily get to that number. And also, like, to be clear, Victor absolutely shouldn't just be catching lobs at the rim and dunking. He should be shooting threes. Right. He should be handling the ball. Like, I'm not saying, when I made the joke earlier about the lobs, it's not that he should only be catching lobs at the rim, but throughout his career, both in Europe, with the international play with France, last year in the NBA, he's never really shot a good percentage. Yeah. So as good as his shot looks, it hasn't gone into that degree yet. And that, to me, that's what this whole year is about, is what strides can he make on the offensive end? Because, I mean, we're going to talk some about the NBA's GM survey later. He's already probably the favorite to win Defensive Player of the Year this year in his second year in the league. So, like, that part is unquestioned.
Yeah. Gobert,
the other part that's going to determine,
could not have liked seeing that vote on that survey. Hey, couple things. First off, what is the actual Vegas over-under number for the Spurs?
I'm going to look it up. I want to say it's a little
bet
lower.
number was 35.5.
Okay. I was actually talking this week to a professional bettor friend that I have who lives in Vegas, and he told me that the sharp bettors, of which he is one, don't think that there was a lot of opportunity in the over-under market. In other words, they didn't think that any numbers were out of whack. Like, the sharp bettors have really looked at it, and he referred to it as a tight market. It was tight. There was no bet that they identified that they really liked, and up and down. So keep that in mind. Second thing I'm going to say is, talking to folks in San Antonio this week, they gave me a new. So now the number, by the way, is 36.5.
Okay, it's gone up.
So the listeners to this pod they're voting with their wallets, and well, they're betting. Actually, I would say they may be betting with Bontemps. They're betting on the under, right? So that would increase.
If it's gone up, they're betting the over, bro.
They're betting the over. I don't see. Yeah. Clearly, I don't know what I'm talking about.
Between snake drafts and betting odds, you're really
very clearly. I don't know what I'm talking about when it comes to fantasy or betting. I think that's quite clear. The other thing I would say is, again, talking to folks in San Antonio, they gave me an interesting number. And I don't know if this is something that you want to use to your advantage, MacMahon, or Bontemps will use to his advantage. They told me that last year, in 41 of their games, it was a 5-point game in the final minute.
Yeah.
And
I think that's also like the vast majority of NBA teams, though, too.
There was not a period. There was a comma. That means he was going to continue talking.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, they won 22 games. So, half of their games, I guess, were close in the last minute. So I don't know. You could be right about that, Bontemps. Like, I don't have the full league numbers.
Listen, say what you want about Chris Paul. I know he's not who he used to be, but you will be an organized team in crunch time when Chris Paul is on the floor. Period.
Yeah.
The Suns missed him last year. The Spurs will benefit from that. And he'll probably play. He's not going to play 82. I understand that. But for these 60 or so games that Chris Paul's on the floor, when those games are close down the stretch, I'm not saying they're going to win every one of them, but they're going to win a lot more of them than they did last year.
So the Spurs were 13-28 in their 41 games that had quote unquote clutch play, which was within 5 points with under 5 minutes to go. They played the 7th most games in the league and had the 3rd worst winning percentage. That said, they won. They had
probably the 3rd worst winning percentage across.
Well, that's what I mean. They won 70. They won like
minutes.
70% of their games were quote unquote clutch games that they won.
Yeah.
So I mean,
yeah.
Look, they're going to win more games this year. That's pretty much without question. I think the two things to wonder about with them in terms of this bet is like Victor's development, like we talked about. The 3 things: the development of some of these other young guys. Devin Vassell already missing time is a problem, and then what happens with Chris Paul and Harrison Barnes and some of these guys that they could potentially turn around and trade in 4 months?
Yeah, that's interesting you bring that up. So I was talking to a league executive, not from San Antonio, and so Chris Paul's salary this year is $11 million. How did he get to that number?
I would assume it fits right into that mid-level trade exception rule now.
That's correct.
That's right.
So, the Spurs, they use their cap space other ways. They took in Harrison Barnes with their cap space and the DeMar DeRozan sign and trade 3-team deal. He might have a trade bonus in that deal because the mid-level exception is a 12.5, give or take, million. And I was talking to Bobby yesterday. There's like 16 or 17 teams that have that. So in the new rules, it used to be the mid-level exception. You could only use it to sign players. You could break it into as many pieces as you wanted, but you could only use it to sign players. Now you can use it like a trade exception. You can use it to take in contracts. In fact, that's what the Charlotte Hornets did when they just accommodated these players on that Knicks deal. That Knicks sign, and they sent 3 guys in a sign and trade. By the way, who I think they've already started cutting them.
Yeah, they cut one of them, and one of them got hurt.
They did.
$1 above the minimum, so they could be sign and trade.
Yeah. So that's what the Hornets did. They took in those guys. So when you have a salary that's in that range, and by the way, the players, one of the criticisms of this in the league was from the agents. They said, well, if you make this a trade exception, the teams are not going to use it to sign players, and they're going to save it as a trade exception. And I think that is sort of borne out a little bit this first year, because I think Bobby told me there was 16 or 17 teams that have the entire amount still sitting there.
Yeah, it's been several years since a team has used the full mid-level exception on a player in free agency. I think Grant Williams is the only one in recent years that got a full mid-level deal for full dollars and full years, and that was obviously in a sign and trade.
Yeah.
So it was already sort of going that way. But yeah, it's an interesting wrinkle in the new CBA, and one that as we get out of the logjam that we're in as salaries, I do think will help to grease the wheels on a lot more trades like the one we saw with Charlotte. But for a guy like Chris Paul, who at this point in his career is not trying to play on a team that's whatever number they end up at is not ultimately
and to be
in
clear,
contention, it makes sense for him to be on a team that's in contention in a few months.
To be clear, the Spurs are not intending that to happen, but the number that he signed for, they didn't just invent it out of thin air. There was a reason why he wanted that number.
It left options open. Also, was he going to get that much from somewhere else anyways?
No, I agree. But why 11 million? Why not 13? Why not 8? He got basically the most he could get with keeping that door open.
And getting a guaranteed starting job.
And being in Texas where they don't have state income tax, I heard, MacMahon. Oh, by the way, as far as this bet goes, MacMahon has high taste, Bontemps, in restaurants. He invited us to a restaurant in the finals where I was almost not allowed in. It was June.
I was there, I know.
It was June in Dallas. It was 98 degrees outside, and I was shown the door because I was wearing shorts.
Yeah, you showed up looking like you were coming from the gym.
No, I showed up like I was looking like I was coming from the golf course.
That's
and that
true.
was not acceptable.
The IT department chose that restaurant.
Well, she might choose the restaurant if you're winning, if you will win this bet as well. So, yeah, is K-Bon, does she get to choose the restaurant if you're victorious, Bontemps? You better hope this is paid off in Dallas if you're the loser.
Listen, I told you, I'm inviting him to Mike Wright's place. Mike Wright's going to have to make some barbecue.
That would definitely be the most economical.
McMahon's claim as to how this is going to go.
Yeah.
Well, I'll worry
that.
about winning the bet. I've already won the bet in my head, so I'll worry about.
There's a big surprise.
I'll worry about that. I'll worry about that later. I put it in the same realm as when our buddy Zach Lowe last year before the season bet me that the Hawks are going to be in the top 6 in the East. And before I could say yes, he said, actually, I'll make it top 5. I said, sure, great. Let's do it.
This is not nearly as optimistic.
No, this one is not. I still have to collect from Zach. Hopefully I'll see him sometime soon here and get it. But yeah.
The Spurs will be collecting on the Hawks probably in the draft lottery.
Yes.
Well, one more.
This one is not that easy a win, though, for sure.
One more thing about San Antonio before I move on. Again, and speaking to folks there, bringing in Chris Paul and Harrison Barnes, they obviously had their reasons why they wanted that veteran presence there. Greg Popovich has talked about Harrison Barnes from the 2019 World Cup team that I covered in China, how he really took to him when they were on that team. There was some, uncertainty, I would say. I wouldn't say it was concern, but there was some wonder from the Spurs. How are all these young guys going to adapt to dealing with these two veterans who come in? And to put it, kindly, Chris Paul has a big voice on teams that he's on.
Demanding is a polite way to put it.
Yeah, and that's true. Demanding sounds real positive, like
Yes.
it's a good thing. With Victor leading the way, the acceptance of Chris Paul's leadership technique, is that well said? Do you like that?
Yeah,
Has gone very well in San Antonio, better than they thought, I am told. And particularly with Chris Paul running basically these de facto clinics on pick and roll play. And not just with Victor, everybody's going to focus on Victor, but they're raving in San Antonio about how Stephen Castle.
I was going to say the young guards to me are the ones who can really, like Victor benefits on the 100%. Floor. The young guards are the ones who can really benefit in terms of learning the game.
So in that GM survey, a couple of GMs picked Stephen Castle as one of the guys who could potentially have a really good rookie season. I can't remember the exact way they framed the question. And by the way, he was a guy who maybe wasn't a classic point guard at UConn, but
he was not.
Sort of was framing himself as a point guard coming into the draft, and the Spurs took him, and he's looked really good. I mean, we're talking preseason games here. He's looked really good in the first couple of preseason games, and saying a team is high on their first round draft pick isn't exactly breaking news, but the Spurs are very happy with what they've seen on him so far. So
I mean, anybody who watched him play at UConn last year, I mean, he's a monster athlete who can do a lot of stuff. And like you said, MacMahon, a guy like him going to Chris Paul point guard school for whether it's 4 months or however long Chris is there this season, there's no way that's going to be anything but helpful to him this year. And just because I have these clutch stats up, and as we know, Brian loves clutch stats. One thing that was interesting. Well, obviously, yes, you're the king of that on the player side. Two numbers that I thought were interesting just from looking at this to mess around with it. So last year, the Celtics played 33 games within the final 5 minutes where it was close. They were 21-12. So they won 64 games. So and all the other games combined, they were 43-6, which is a sign of just how good they were overall, right? They were a dominant team. You get into clutch time situations, it's usually a little bit more of a 50-50 shot to win, obviously, if the game is close late. Two teams that stood out on the other way, the Lakers played the same number of games, 33 games. They're 24-9. The Lakers went 47-35. So the rest of the schedule, games that weren't tight at the end, they were 23-26. It's interesting to think about this year because year to year, these clutch numbers tend to fluctuate because they are obviously there's a lot more randomness in a close game at the end. The Lakers were a sub 500 team in over half their schedule. Similar way, team where Tim is at, Dallas Mavericks, they played 32, second fewest clutch games in the league last year. They went 23-9. So the rest of their schedule, they were 28-23, which again is not the 50-win pace. This is the team that is hoping to be back in the top 4 in the West again. So it will just be interesting to see how some of that stuff starts to look this year and if any of that carries over.
I mean, you say randomness, and like statistically, I understand what you're saying. Having said that, when you have elite creators and closers, it's going to go up in clutch situations. LeBron, Luka, Kyrie, Chris Paul over the course of his career. And it's interesting because we'll see if it's something that it's more difficult for a big man to do. Joker is an exception because Joker's a 7-foot point guard.
Mm-hmm.
Joker runs the offense. It's more difficult for a big man to consistently be a dominant clutch force because he has to rely on a point guard to set him up, which Victor now has.
It's just interesting because if the team like the Lakers or the Mavs goes 19-13 instead of 24-9, or 18-13 instead of 23-9, in a Western Conference where everybody's going to be in the mix and bunched up, like those 5 wins could mean a lot. So it's just something to keep in mind as we go into the year.
All right. By the way, the rookies, which were so maligned, they're not looking so bad. We're 1 week into the preseason, but there's been some rookie performances. Zachary Richichet in his first game for the Hawks, like
he looked good. And he did a lot of different things. I mean, he did things with the ball in his hand. He did things as a roll man.
And I would say, talking to scouts who were at the game, they were like, by the way, he got no votes from the GMs as rookie of the year. Yeah. So I would say the expectations are not super high, at least within the league. The scout that I talked to said, he had a real presence about him for a guy who's 19, who's sort of looks like he may have a learning curve, which he probably will. They were like, boy, his presence was good. And by the way, I'm also hearing, I watched a little bit of the Hornets game against the Knicks over the weekend. I hope I'm pronouncing Tijan Salon, their super athletic French forward. He has looked very interesting in the first week. And those guys, I'm going to tell you something. France has something going on. France has got something going on. Now, obviously, Victor is an athletic, just a freak. He's a freak amongst freaks. But like these guys that France is putting out, we'll see how Bilal Coulibaly does in year 2.
Yeah.
But like, and again, Alex Sarr, he's going to have a big learning curve. But there's all these young French guys who look really good. None of them are playing for the national team other than Victor. Coulibaly was on, but he didn't get on the floor.
Right.
And obviously, how do you pronounce the guy who's going to be in this draft? Bontemps?
Nolan Traore. Yeah.
He's going to be another lottery pick in this draft. I mean, they've had 5 lottery picks the last 2 drafts, I think, or 4.
Yeah, he's going to be a top 5 pick, and he probably would have been the number 1 pick in this year's draft, like several of these other guys have been in it. So yeah, like we've talked about a bunch. I mean, over the next 5 to 8, the next couple of Olympics, it's going to be the Canadians, it's going to be the French, and it's going to be us. Like those are the 3 teams that are going to stand out over everybody else from a talent standpoint.
All right, MacMahon, the GMs picked Reed Shepherd to be their pick for Rookie of the Year. I know you spent some time around the Rockets. The Rockets are feeling pretty good about, they finished the season last year on a strong kick. They're feeling pretty good about themselves right now. I know they're not technically on I-35, but what about your old buddies in Houston?
Yeah, and listen, Ime Udoka came out very clearly, stated that the goal was to be a playoff team this year. And they think that is a realistic goal. I mean, you can argue
phase 3?
It's not quite. It's phase 2.5 maybe, because phase 3 would be so they're in a fascinating situation because
you're like Bontemps with the tiers. Bontemps has 11 tiers for 15 teams. You're like, now you've got phase 2.5.
Well, I think phase 3 for them is they've made the playoffs and probably pushed some of these chips in, because despite the fact that they still owe draft capital for the Chris Paul, Russell Westbrook trade to Oklahoma City, they've done a great job of collecting assets, and they still have, I think it's 27 swap rights with Brooklyn. So they didn't even give up all their Nets capital, but they got all that Suns stuff. And, they've got a potentially the Dallas 29 pick from Brooklyn as well. They're loaded up on draft picks. They're loaded up on young talent that they've drafted. They do have like Steven Adams, who they think is going to be a key role player as a backup center for them, expiring contract. Jeff Green, who valuable veteran presence, expiring contract. Jayshawn Tate, expiring contract. I say all that to say, if a situation presents itself before this trade deadline, the Rockets are in prime position to pounce. Now, it has to be the right situation, and it's hard to see who that would be, because what they're trying to do is create an extended window. In other words, they're not trying to trade for a 38-year-old, 34-year-old, 36-year-old superstar who it'd be a 2 or 3 year window type of situation. They're trying to trade for a guy who can grow with this young group that they have and it'd be, by an NBA standards, a long window, a 5+ year window. And look, they're still figuring out exactly what they have with all these young kids. It's not out of the realm of possibility that Alperen Şengün or even Jalen Green sign a contract extension, but if it was easy, it'd be done. I would say there's
12 days as we record this. There's 12 days left before the deadline, which is October 21st.
Yeah, I believe the Rockets have a number in mind for both of those guys that they would be willing to commit to, but then they also recognize the potential value of letting that play out in restricted free agency. It's a weak free agent class next year, but
it's a light, at least right now, cap space. There's not a lot of teams with cap space.
Really, it's Brooklyn, and Houston could be the second team. Fred VanVleet has been everything that they hoped last year. Next year, he's basically a $45 million team option. But as far as Reed Sheppard goes, it's really interesting because he's going to. They're very confident that he's going to earn minutes. But they've got a lot of they've got VanVleet, they've got Jalen Green. Amen Thompson, is he a guard? Is he a forward? Sometimes he's a center. But there's a lot of competition for minutes there. So I'm not sure Sheppard's going to get enough minutes to put up big numbers.
Yeah, one of the reasons why the casinos have Zach Edey as the favorite is because he's starting.
Yeah.
By the way, it doesn't look too bad.
Rookie year is oftentimes about opportunity, to your point, as much as it is about talent.
Did you see him? Did you see Zach Edey finish that lob from Ja the other day?
I saw and I heard it sitting courtside. I heard it.
You were at the game. That's right.
Clearly, yes.
Right.
It was a thunderous finish, and I thought it was kind of a pretty typical big man preseason debut. Got in early foul trouble. Certainly, as Taylor Jenkins said, he's got to adjust to the speed and the physicality of the game. I forgot how many minutes he played, but he had 5 fouls, and he's kind of got to figure out when he's looking for a deep seal, when he needs to clear out in space. But I would be surprised if Edey didn't put up pretty solid.
ESPN Bet Jackson says ESPN Bet has Zach Edey plus 400 and Reed Sheppard at plus 650.
Reed Sheppard, the thing, like talking to people about him, he is quite athletic, like a vertical athlete. He is not like a long athlete. He's one of those guys who, like, the wingspan's not impressive, that sort of thing. He is a pure point guard who has logo type of range. So they're really excited about him. Talking to people around the league, like, it's not like they reached for him. Like, there are a lot of teams that thought Reed Sheppard belonged, at the top of the draft. So,
by the way, another, not just to cut in, just because I just otherwise I'd forget. Do you guys see what Kel'el Ware, the #1 draft pick of the Miami Heat, did in his first game? Whoa, this guy looks like Derek Lively with a 3-point shot.
Well, he's interesting.
Let's not overreact, but whoa.
Let's not overreact while we're wildly overreacting.
We're doing this podcast on October 10th. What do you want me to do?
I'm just laughing at you wildly overreacting, and then in hindsight saying, well, let's not overreact.
All right, fair enough.
The thing about Kel'el Ware is he was a super athlete who had kind of a middling season at Indiana. It wasn't clear where he was going to go in the draft.
Motor questions.
And we saw, right, motor questions, right? And then he lands at Miami. And you go, well, the guy with motor questions going to Miami, that's an interesting fit, right? But it's one of those things where it could go one of two ways. Like, if the motor questions continue in Miami, Brian, you in particular, spent a lot of time in Miami. Tim and I have been around Miami enough. We know how that will go with Spo and company. Or you could say, if a guy with massive physical tools goes to Miami and gets into Heat program and it clicks, all of a sudden you're cooking with gas. And
they do a pretty good job of getting the potential out of guys.
Yes. And so he is a guy that I am very intrigued to see how things go there, because long-term, if that does pop and he becomes a real player, obviously Bam has long been one of the most versatile bigs in the league.
Yeah.
And you can do a lot of interesting stuff there. And you saw this summer, Bam, obviously it's international ball, it's a little different, but Bam playing next to Anthony Davis, essentially playing as a ball handling 4 on Team USA. Like, that lineup was devastating throughout the tournament and in the games before. And so that is going to give Miami some interesting wrinkles that they can potentially throw at stuff.
Well, especially if Ware really can't shoot it. Like, that's the key. You can't, like the whole Cavs corner thing. It's really tough to play 2 non-shooting bigs together.
Mhm.
But if he legitimately is even a solid corner 3-point shooter, then you can play 2 bigs together. But Wendy, let me just ask you, where do you have Ware in terms of, like, if you're talking about Alonzo Mourning, Shaq, Bam, where does he rank on that list?
Yeah, well, I would say 3A. Yeah, well, Bam, by the way, shot a bunch of threes in the Olympics because he was playing 4, and it's a shorter line, and he loved it. And so he's now shooting threes. And you got Kel'el Ware, at least early on, shooting threes.
Well, that has also been an annual tradition for
I
years.
know, but
this is the year Bam is going to shoot threes.
I
So
know.
again, we'll see if Bam starts shooting threes.
Mike Brown announced he wanted Domantas Sabonis, who's averaged 1 3-point shot in his career, to average 4 or 5 a game.
Yes, I mean, this is the annual rite of passage for every team in preseason. Everybody talks about playing faster, as you like to joke, and everybody likes to talk about bombing away from 3.
Having said that, there are some teams that are averaging 53s a game so far, but obviously the preseason. As another diversion, because I keep doing this and I'm calling myself on it, but since we're talking about the Heat named their floor at their arena for Pat Riley. They had this great video where they refused to let him know about it because they knew that if they told him they were going to do it, he would throw all these roadblocks in front of it. And so they basically surprised him. Mickey Harrison, the owner, surprised him, and they're naming the floor for him. And he got, Pat Riley is a guy who makes people emotional. He doesn't get emotional too often. He got choked up. It was a great video that the Heat put together. They announced it this week. And I will say, it gives me an opportunity to point something out because Jerry West, the late, great Jerry West, is going into the Hall of Fame as a contributor in the next week. The 3rd different time he's gone to the Hall of Fame, player, executive, and now contributor. Pat Riley should be going into the Hall of Fame as an executive.
100%.
This is 30th year with the Heat. The majority of those years have been as the primary is the executive. And
I mean, he was the executive from the day he showed up. I mean, even
right, but I mean,
he's ran the team for 30 years.
Right, of course. But I'm just saying he's now been an executive in Miami longer than he was coach.
For sure.
And 7 finals, and not only 7 finals, but building 3 or 4 different versions of the team that have reached the final. And my education in my 4 years in Miami, I treasure. I know LeBron treasures his education he got from Pat Riley, even if that relationship didn't go great. But the Miami Heat are tremendous because of Riley. And so I would just say, because he's being honored, and this is honor and moment, like Pat Riley's been honored a lot in his career. He doesn't really need it. But I'm just saying, if you're going to have people go in as 3 different things like Jerry West, who earned all 3 of those, Pat Riley has earned as an executive. So that's what I'm going to say. All right, back to the 100%. Houston Rockets. Sorry about that. You mentioned Şengün. So part of the thing is, once you sign a guy to an extension, it is possible to trade players who've signed extensions, but it becomes quite difficult. And especially under the new apron rules, you're going to need a PhD to figure out those types of trades. This applies, I think, to a couple of guys in this zone. Şengün is one of them because, as you mentioned, MacMahon, the Rockets aren't sure where they're going to go. They may keep this team together, grow them in this group for the next 3 or 4 years, or if an opportunity pops up, like there was reporting over the summer about their interest in Kevin Durant. The Suns slammed the door on that very hard with an on-the-record quote from Matt Ishbia. But the point is, you're not going to, if you're thinking about going after a guy like that, signing Şengün the extension may not help you, especially if you can't agree to an extension. The other guy I would say is Jonathan Kuminga, who the Warriors, again, are on the record. Mike Dunleavy, their GM, is on the record as saying, I don't remember how he said it, but basically that they're aggressively looking, which we already knew because they looked at LeBron, looked at Paul George, looked at Lauri Markkanen.
There's no point in going all in to be slightly above average.
So was that his quote?
Yes. I mean, that was what he said before the training camp, which I think applies to what their overall situation is. If they're going for a swing, it's to make a meaningful
and they've also
difference.
made it clear that that Podziemski is, I don't know.
It would take an absolute grand slam, I think, for Podziemski.
Right. So if they don't want to trade Podziemski and they're looking to swing big for the fences.
Yeah, they're not doing half measures regardless of what's going on.
Okay.
And I think the same applies to Houston. And again, you mentioned KD, and here's the thing. It's not like there can be different opinions within an organization, right? But what I would tell you is if things were to go south in Phoenix, which, look, the Suns have a chance to be really good this year. This is not a prediction. This is a hypothetical. If things were to go south in Phoenix, I think the Rockets' target would not be Kevin Durant.
I think it would be the younger guy.
A superstar in his prime, because they're trying to create an extended window with, and obviously they would have to, in a deal like that, you're going to have to give up good young players, but they're probably going to have 7 rotation players who are like 23 or younger.
Well, listen, and the thing we've talked about a lot, I was at the Knicks-Wizards game on Wednesday, and, that was the first time they played at the Garden with their new look starting 5. And 4, 5, 6 months ago, you'd have said the Knicks were the best positioned team in the league to land a superstar player when they became available. That is no longer the case. They pushed their chips in for Mikal Bridges and Karl Towns. And I would argue that as you sit here right now, the two teams that are best positioned to trade for a superstar player, that are realistically going to acquire a superstar player, are the two teams we just talked about, which is why the Şengün and Kuminga extension situations in particular are interesting, because those will indicate where these teams are sitting in terms of what they're thinking about what's possible in the next few months and what's potentially possible in the next 6 months and beyond.
Yeah, it's really a two-pronged thing. One, if you sign them to extensions, they become very hard to trade. And two,
very hard to trade this season.
Yes. And two, because next year's, we just said, but just to reinforce it, because next year's salary cap pool is shallow, who are you bidding against? So you're limiting your options and you're potentially bidding against yourself. And that's hard to explain to a young player who wants to get paid.
Yep.
But from a strategy standpoint, if we get to October 21st and Kuminga and Şengün don't have extensions,
and Jalen Green,
I wouldn't be surprised.
Right.
And I wouldn't say it means they hate him. It just means they're trying to be strategic.
Well, and the other thing to think about, to go back to the game I was at last night, Jordan Poole is now the full-time point guard for the Wizards, which is going to be an interesting experiment in its own right. However, if you go back to when Mike Dunleavy took over for Bob Myers 18 months ago-ish, right? First week on the job, what did he do? He traded Jordan Poole to the Wizards, right? And got out of that extension. And by the way, if Jordan Poole was still on the Warriors right now, we wouldn't be talking about them doing any of this stuff, because they would be in cap hell, and their situation would be a mess, because they would have that extension on their books. And as we talked about a lot, with the way the league is currently set up, if you got a contract like that on your books that you can't move, whether it's Zach LaVine in Chicago, I mean, we just saw it with Karl Towns. The Knicks were the one team. Obviously, Karl's a very good player, but the Knicks are the one team that was really aggressively interested in him. You look around the league, if you got a big number like that and you can't move it, it really hamstrings you from doing anything with your roster. And so I think when you look at these extension negotiations, that's the other part of it that I think teams either should be or are factoring into it, which is that you got to really be sure, if you're giving a guy 30, 35, $40 million right now, that you feel really good about either that guy being a main piece for you going forward, or it's a contract you 100% believe you can get value for in a trade. And otherwise, like you said, Brian, with no real competition next summer, let it play out. If somebody like Jalen Green or whoever plays like an all-star and deserves a max or whatever next summer, great. That's a good problem to have. But if not, you don't put yourself in a box where you're stuck with a contract you can't move, and it foils your plans to go get some player next summer or beyond that you otherwise would be able to go get.
And just real quick, you didn't mention Oklahoma City as one of the teams that would be, primed to take a swing at a superstar, which obviously they have
Yes.
all the assets in the world, but you didn't mention them because of you don't think they have the desire to take that.
Yeah, exactly.
With the young core they have.
Exactly. I said that's why I made clear that it was the common. It's a good point. That's why I said it's a combination of the ability to go make a trade and the willingness to go make that kind of a trade, right? Because I think if the way the Thunder operate, it would be outside of their operational strategy, at least as they've shown it, to go make a move like that. Doesn't mean they can't, doesn't mean they won't. Obviously, they've got as many assets as anybody in the league, but yeah, I don't see that being the strategy they're going to take. I think you saw this summer getting Alex Caruso, getting Isaiah Hartenstein, right? Those are the kind of moves that I think you will see the Thunder continue to make additions that shore up what they have.
And Sam Presti, in his pregame meeting with the media, the president of the Thunder, he said that, he wasn't, sort of focused on any sort of midseason trade. Last year they did the midseason trade for Gordon Hayward. It left them some options, but it really didn't work out. It wasn't like a catastrophe or anything, but it didn't work out.
It was also partly to give them the money to do something like I said, sign Isaiah Hartenstein.
Right. And by the way, one of the guys they traded to Charlotte in that deal, Trey Mann, is looking good this preseason. But the thing about the Thunder is they have incredible optionality. Like a year at the end of last season, Sam, I think, made it clear he wasn't intending to trade Josh Giddey, even though Giddey was being played off the floor in the playoffs. Giddey came to the team and said, I want to be traded because he was going to be a bench player. And
you do that deal 100 times out of 100.
Well, of
Giddey's
course.
kicking and screaming or begging.
I understand. So what happened was Giddey came to them and said, if I'm going to be a bench player, and then I think what happened was they went to Giddey and said, Josh, we need you to come off the bench.
Yeah.
And he said, I kind of don't want to come off the bench if I'm about to get paid. And so he said, I kind of would like to see if there's a trade out there. And so they investigated the market and found Alex Caruso. And Perfect. So that's why if Sam Presti says, I'm not super interested in like making a huge midseason trade, but then if something happens in midseason where they can get, a guy that they think is a finishing piece to a title. But I think to the point that you just made, Bontemps, I think Houston and Golden State are more in hunter mode in the deals, whereas I think Presti is taking incoming calls as opposed to making calls.
And the Thunder have what I think they can reasonably be optimistic is the foundation of a long-term contender. They have their star trio. SGA.
They're only picked to finish atop the West this year with a roster that's like 12 years old. So,
right.
I would agree.
Don't tell them that. One. I mean, you got Shea, at media day saying, I want to keep our mindset of when we were getting embarrassed and we stunk.
Well, that's fine, but he is a first-team All-NBA player, the MVP last year.
The favorite, according to the GMs.
I thought that surprised me a little bit. Chet Holmgren.
We'll get to that. Didn't surprise me much.
I think that Chet Holmgren is widely perceived to be a future multi-time All-Star, and I'm not sure Chet's their second-best player. Jalen Williams, J-Dub, is awfully good. And then
let's talk about that real quick.
Yeah.
One of the things in the GM survey that made me go, was that now there's 30 votes. This is not 200 votes. So it could be like 6 votes to 5 or whatever. But J-Dub, Jalen Williams, the wing on the Thunder, was picked as the player most likely to have a breakout season, not by a huge percentage.
Yeah.
But that was an interesting pick. And he said some things when I was at media day. He talked about his process in the offseason where he really wanted to take a critical eye of himself. He wanted to see where he really struggled. He went through these elongated film sessions that he said he basically ordered up his lowlights. He wanted to see his worst moments. And he said it was hard. He said it's not fun to see your worst moments, but he felt it was important to him. And he also was like, I was just doing my own thing. I was just focused on my process. He looks great in the preseason. Absolutely spectacular. He's shooting the ball great and all the caveats of it the preseason. But I loved hearing his mindset. I've loved what I've seen out of him in the preseason. And he's in this magical, sometimes magical, not guaranteed, but this magical third year. The third year for so many players is a magical year where they sort of come into their own. And so the GMs see it. And, if you're looking for a reason why the Thunder could pull off winning it all, it's because they have a bona fide superstar sitting there. Yeah. They brought in a tremendous wing defender. They have now optionality with their bigs with Hartenstein. If Jalen Williams is an all-star player this year, and I'm not saying that's what's going to happen.
I think it's a very realistic possibility.
Well, listen, it's what's sitting there. I mean, I have a piece that's running Friday today on the website on to the 10 people that are going to define the upcoming season are.
It's a really good story, by the way. Not to flatter you, but
well, thank you. We'll talk about it we'll probably talk about it on the next pod. But I asked Brian as I was putting the list together, I said, what do you think about Jalen Williams? And I ended up not including him on the list. But the reason I was debating putting him on the list is exactly the point you just made. If Jalen Williams takes that leap and we see, like I've talked about before, I don't vote for guys for most improved in their second year because you're supposed to improve in your second year.
I agree with that.
But a lot of times, the guy who wins most improved player in the league is a guy in his third year that goes from being a good player to an all-star. And if Jalen Williams makes that leap this year, because remember, I mean, MacMahon sat courtside for every game in that series last year. Jalen Williams struggled. He was guarding Kyrie. He was doing a lot of work at the defensive end. But offensively, it was a challenge in that series. And it's a big part.
Series. Very good defensive series.
Very good. But those offensive struggles were a big part of why they didn't win that series and ultimately advance in the playoffs. And if he can make strides there, and in that moment next year or next spring, as their number 2 guy next to Shea, deliver in moments like that, that very well could be the difference between them winning the title or making the finals or losing in the second round again. And he's going to be one of the important people in the whole league this season for just that point you made, Brian.
Well, and listen, he struggled offensively in that series. Kyrie struggled offensively in that series as well. And obviously Oklahoma City's got a great team defense, but J-Dub was a big part of that. I think the arrival of Alex Caruso in Oklahoma City could pay tremendous benefits to Jalen Williams, because whether Caruso starts or not, Lou Dort gets the toughest assignment 1 through 4. Jalen Williams has gotten the second toughest. That's part of why I think people who were giving Shai Gilgeous-Alexander Defensive Player of the Year votes or even all defense votes were not watching the Thunder.
It's because he led the league in steals. That's why he was getting.
I understand that. That's why I said they're not watching the Thunder. They're just looking at their box.
Right.
My point is, with Caruso there, like Jalen Williams is still going to get the toughest or the second toughest assignment sometimes, but not for 34 minutes a game, right? I don't think there's going to be nearly as much of a taxing situation on him defensively, which I think can benefit him on the other end of the floor. The other thing, like when you're talking about this guy, remember, he was a no-name recruit. I'm not sure that he was an any star type of recruit. He was like a nobody, and then kind of became like, okay, well, there's this kid at Santa Clara, fringe NBA prospect to second round prospect to he goes to the combine like, whoa, first rounder, ends up in the lottery, rookie of the year runner up. His scoring average jumped 5 points last year. His assists went up over a point. The percentage is up across the board. He was 4th in most improved player last year. My point is, this guy is got a track record of getting significantly better every single season. And there's every reason to believe that continues. And if he's significantly better this year, he's one of the top,
30 players in the league.
Yeah. He's an all-star caliber player.
You mentioned
it's a pretty good couple years, by the way, for Bill Duffy, Santa Clara.
That's what I was going to say.
Jalen Williams 2 years ago as a rising guy who flew up the boards late. And Brandon Podziemski the next year, who transferred from Illinois, was not seen as a guy on draft boards and ends up in the top 20 and is in a great spot with the Warriors.
Bill Duffy, legendary agent, has been an agent for 30, 40 years. I don't want to age him too much, but
I was talking to him the other day. He said 40 years, so I think you could say 40, and it's
so
okay.
truly one of the legends in the NBA. Bill Duffy went to Santa Clara. I'm fairly certain he's on the board of the university. Okay. Jalen Williams transferred in there and was practicing. He didn't know about him. And somebody was like, "Hey, have you seen this new guy who just transferred in?" He's like, "No." He's like, "Well, you better get over there." And he goes over there and he ends up with a lottery pick.
Yeah.
So yeah, bad. but that was the thing last year or 2 years ago. I was with Jalen Williams when his brother Cody got ranked 4th or 5th by Jonathan Givony in his future rankings of prospects, and he was really excited that he had but his brother went was it 19th?
10th to Utah.
Oh, 10th. He was in the lottery again.
Yeah, he's lottery.
So so somebody asked him, they go, "Hey, Jalen, can you give your brother advice about being this ranked and the pressure?" He's like, "No, I can't." He goes, "I was never on Givony's list. I have no idea what it's like to be ranked by Givony." So
right.
But he's a really great story and really interesting to watch, and just I admire his personality, I admire his work ethic, and
the Thunder have put together a very specific group of guys and how they're wired and how they go about their business. It's part of why I made the point earlier in my belief about what their approach to team building is going to be, because they've had a very defined approach and they've had a ton of success. And I agree with you too on Caruso. The best part about them trading for Caruso in particular, he's probably not going to play more than 20 or 25 minutes a game. I'd say 25 minutes a game max. And that's fine. He only has to play 20 minutes a game. He can play his role perfectly, and that'll be great.
The ego to talent level, the ego to talent ratio on that team collectively is amazing. Seriously, you spend time around their team, they're competitive.
Listen, I'll say this: Chet has been selective on what he says. Chet, he's got a little something.
That's why I want to make the differentiation.
And Shea says all the right things, and he's a hell of a player.
No,
he's also got a very healthy ego too.
Don't mistake ego for competitiveness.
No, I know.
No, but Chet wants to kill you. Shea wore a trench coat to a playoff game in Dallas because he was going for the Omar from the Wire vibe.
Yes.
Okay.
They've got a little something to him now.
I gotcha, but you're not going to see them talking bleep.
Yeah, well, and it is Hartenstein said it when he came in that he was, I don't know, surprised, but definitely impressed by the maturity of the group. It's a fun, goofy group of young guys that are serious about their business, serious about the work. They buy in. And the great thing about their star trio, plus the pieces they brought in to complement them, is Shea, Jalen Williams, Chet. They all fit. They all complement each other. They all enhance each other. Look, 80% of the GMs picked Oklahoma City to win the West. I was a little bit surprised it was that high, but you see it, and they've got a chance to have a really long runway by modern NBA standards.
All right. I have to cut this short right now. I know we're going to talk more about this GM survey, but I was late because of a technical issue, and I have to leave now. So I'm so sorry.
Well, it is your podcast.
I'm so sorry. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for being patient today. Thank you to Jackson, our producer. Thank you to MacMahon. Thank you to Bontemps. Thank you for watching and listening to the Hoop Collective. I think we're going to 3 a week next week. Are we starting next week?
What do you mean by we?
Well, you gents will be on twice a week, and that's it. I protest the second time a week, but okay, I'll allow it. Anyway, we go to 3 times a week next week: Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I believe. Right, Jackson?
He said yes in the chat.
Seems like a lot. That seems like a lot. But okay, I'll allow it. Thank you again. So we'll talk to you on Monday.
Adios, amigos.